To sew a swing coat, a step-by-step tutorial with sewing pattern. Hi sewers, welcome to my studio. I'm Sasha, I'm a fashion designer and teacher, and today I have a tutorial and a sewing pattern showing you how to make this super swooshy and dramatic swing coat. If you'd like to sew along, you can find the pattern in my Etsy store and I'll pop the link down below. There's two style options for this pattern, a long version that has loads of volume and falls just above the knee, and a shorter version that falls at the high hip and pairs really nicely with my palazzo pants pattern if you'd like to make a full suit look. I'd say this pattern is an intermediate make. It's my most complex pattern so far, and although I'll be going into lots of detail in the tutorial, there are a few processes that you may find challenging as an absolute beginner or as a first garment project. The coat has a tailored look with a striking big lapel, but I've developed a few new techniques to make some of the trickier elements, like the bound buttonholes and pockets, a little bit more accessible rather than using traditional methods. So although they look impressive and give a tailored feel to the piece, you don't need to have any previous tailoring experience. So if you have a couple of garment makes under your belt and would like a project that's challenging but rewarding, then this swing coat will be perfect for you. And if you'd like to recreate the whole look I'm wearing here, I'll also be releasing this poppy flower design as a digital print tile set, which I'll link below when it's ready as well. So let's have a look at the coats on the stand and talk through some of the design details so we know where we're headed before we get started. Swing coat design details. The striking silhouette of the swing coat comes from the complementing voluminous shapes of the main body and the sleeves, which are both based around the form of a circle. One of my inspirations for this piece was the simple shapes used by Cristobal Balenciaga in some of his earlier designs, and I used a circle as my starting point to echo that. The body is formed of one continuous half circle of cloth that drapes from the shoulder and swings around the body from the back, with the concentration of the volume falling towards the front of the coat. This gives the piece its flexibility and size as it allows for a large range of chest and stomach shapes, from flat to rounded and everything in between, and for fluctuations that you may have in your personal size over time or throughout the month or day. The sleeves also echo that circular form and are each made from a single piece of cloth, with 6 sections joined together at the bottom to create a hexagonal meeting point. The armhole then sits at the front of the sleeve rather than at its base, which moves the volume of the sleeve to the back behind the arm and balances the shape made by the volume on the front body. Pushing that sleeve volume to the back also allows more freedom of movement for the arm, which means you can have those big dramatic sleeves without them getting in the way as you go about your day. The armhole is circular and it sits at a 3/4 length on the lower arm, again allowing us to have a big voluminous sleeve while maintaining practicality and wearability to the piece. The collar and lapel are also big and dramatic and oversized in keeping with the proportions of the rest of the coat. And while they have a tailored appearance, the construction isn't exactly as you'd find in a classically tailored piece, as the curve of the back of the collar is quite loose and sits a little bit more open than you'd find on a classic suit jacket. The undercollar is cut on the straight grain rather than on the bias, as I found it worked better with the structure of the shape, although I have added a stitch to define the roll line, which is what we call the place where the collar folds over, which is a feature you'll find in some tailored pieces. We then have a notched lapel, which is the term used when you have this V-shaped gap at the point where the lapel and the collar meet. The collar is deep and elongated, and the notch sits quite low on the body, hitting the wide lapel with a kind of 1990s to 1930s inspiration. And the lapels then fall across the body to overlap each other in a double-breasted style. On a tailored jacket, the point at which the fronts meet and we find the first button is called the button stance. And in this case, the stance is dropped low to sit at the natural waist. We call the line that runs from the fold in the collar down through the fold in the lapel the break line. and I've added a slight curve to the break at the notch point here, rather than keeping a straight line as you would more commonly see. Because the front of the coat has lots of volume and swing, this curve in the break line allows the lapel to move naturally with the main body in both its open and closed positions. And it also creates a much more flattering hang for larger busts, although it will still sit really nicely if you have a flat or smaller chest like me. Moving on to the finishings, although these look like bound buttonholes, they're actually created by using a seam allowance in the facing, which is a new technique I've developed for this project. The process is a little bit easier than a traditional bound buttonhole, particularly if you're using a heavier weight contrast cloth like the wool Melton or faux leather I've used here. And they're made to accommodate a large 3 to 4 centimetre button in keeping with the proportions of the rest of the coat. Moving round to the pockets, it's the same method used to create the look of tailored jets at the openings. But again, these are actually formed from the seam allowances of the pocket facings in the contrast cloth. The pocket bags are made from the lining fabric, and the pocket bag for the shorter version is slightly shallower so it doesn't interfere with the line of the shorter hem. Then if we have a look at the inside of the coat, we have deep facings in the contrast cloth that give a little bit of structure to the double-breasted front without hindering that swing movement that defines the piece. The other thing that's a little bit unusual on this coat is that the lining goes all the way down to the hemline. And again, that's to give as much movement as possible to the piece, so it really takes on the natural drape of the main body cloth. And then finally, if we have a look at the cuffs, we have this bound effect at the opening in the contrast fabric, which is actually formed from the edge of the cuff facing, which is a little bit easier than using a binding strip. And it's another technique I developed for this piece to make it a little bit more accessible. And if we look inside the sleeve, you can see they're finished by hand tacking the edge of the cuff facing to the sleeve lining, as it's a lot more manageable than bagging out the sleeve openings if you're making a longer version in a heavier cloth like the pink Melton example here. So that should give you a better idea of where we're headed with the make, and let's have a look at which fabrics work best for this project. Swing coat fabric choices. For this project, you'll need your main body fabric, which will form the outside of the swing coat, a contrast fabric for the collar, lapels, cuffs and finishings, a lining fabric for inside, and also a small amount of interfacing for finishings and to strengthen the collar. If you don't want to have a contrast effect, you can use the main body fabric for all the elements on the outside of the coat. But I think having that change of colour or texture really helps to bring out the details of the piece. There's quite a wide range of cloths that will work for this design, and the cloth that you choose will really determine the character of the finished piece. So you can create a heavy winter coat or a light summer jacket, and the pattern would also work as a dress coat for occasion wear or as a really fun and dramatic raincoat. The two key factors to think about are the weight and the drape or structure of the cloth. The weight of the cloth literally refers to how heavy it is in grams per square metre, which is what the GSM initials mean that you'll see in a fabric's description. And that will mainly affect the warmth of the final piece. The drape of the cloth refers to the way it hangs. So a fabric with a lot of drape, like this one, will handle softly, have a lot of movement to it, and follow the line of the body. And then at the other end of the scale, a fabric with a lot of structure to it will be much stiffer with less movement, so it's able to hold the shape of a garment away from the body to create silhouettes with a lot of volume and drama. And fabric will always have a combination of these two factors. So if we compare the three cloths I've used for my examples, the first is heavyweight and structured, the second is lightweight and structured, and the third is heavyweight and drapey, which leaves just lightweight and drapey, which is a fabric type to avoid with this design. So if we have a look at the three examples I have here, in this long version, which is the one you'll be seeing throughout the tutorial stages, I've used a wool Melton for both the main body and contrast cloths. Melton is the name given to this very tightly woven heavy wool cloth that's similar in feel to a felt. And as a reference, this one is about 650 grams per square metre and about 2 millimetres thick. The contrast cloth here is quite unusual as it's a Melton bonded to a chiffon overlay to get that pink leopard print. But the key thing for you to know is that both cloths here are heavyweight and structured, and they're about the same thickness as each other too. The weight of this cloth makes it a good choice for a warmer winter coat, and its structure creates a dramatic look that emphasises the voluminous shapes of the sleeves and the main body. Then, if we take a look at this example of the shorter version, I've used a printed cotton drill for the main body fabric and a white faux leather for the contrast. This fabric also has quite a bit of structure to it, but it's much lighter, so you can see it's given us much more of a summer jacket feel, but still with a crisp shape and lots of volume in the sleeves. As a reference, this cotton drill is 250 grams per square metre, which I'd say is the lightest you'd want to go if you're using a cotton. I do really like the way this one has turned out, but if I was to make a summer version again, I'd more likely go for something a little bit heavier like a denim, which would still be nice and cool to wear, but would also be a little bit less prone to creasing. Having the heavier faux leather at the collar and lapels helps to give a little bit more structure without adding too much warmth. So that's also something to consider if you're making a lighter, more summery version like this. Although if you're using something a little bit heavier like a denim, that would be suitable for both the main body and the contrast cloths. Then the third example I've made is another short version but in a softer wool, to create more of a tailored jacket feel that would be perfect for spring or autumn. The main body cloth here is a wool mix, and although it's quite thick, it's a lot less tightly woven than the Melton in the longer version, giving it a much softer hang. So you can see that while it still works really nicely, the silhouette created is a lot softer, with a little bit of drape to the sleeves and less structure away from the body at the hem. So if you did use a cloth with a little bit more drape to it, this would be the kind of look you'd end up with. I don't know the exact weight or composition of this fabric because I got it in a local remnant shop, but as a guess, I'd say it's probably a wool acrylic mix with a weight of about 450 grams per square metre. The contrast in this example is a chiffon bonded wool Melton of the same type used in the first example, and I'd say again it works well for the collar, lapel and finishings to have that little bit of extra structure. So if you are using a drapier cloth, I would try to balance it out with a more structured contrast, or to interface your pieces here if you are using the same cloth throughout. Any type of standard lining fabric will work for this project. So it could be matte or satin and made of viscose, poly, silk or cotton. So just go with what you like the look of best next to your main body fabric and the contrast. And I've used a poly Bemberg type lining on all of my examples. For the interfacing, I always recommend woven interfacing over the non-woven papery kind you can get, as although you'll pay a little bit more for it, the quality is so much better and it forms a much nicer bond with the fabric. For this project, the pieces that you interface will depend on the weight of the cloth. In all three of my examples, as my contrast cloths already had quite a bit of structure to them, I only used interfacing on the undercollar and to create the openings for the buttonholes and pockets. However, if your contrast fabric has more drape to it or it's lighter in weight, then it's a good idea to also fuse the top collar, lapels and facing pieces. For example, if I'd used cotton drill for the contrast as well as the main body on this example, I would fuse all of the contrast pieces to make sure that tailored look stays crisp. Then for your buttons, the buttonholes have been designed to accommodate a diameter of between 3 to 4 centimetres, and I decided to keep that element fixed as I think that size of button gives the best balance to the coat overall. And the buttonhole placement is worked out on the pattern quite precisely to keep the front facings and lapels fixed in place correctly without the need for any tailoring knowledge. But if you wanted a clean front or much smaller or larger buttons, I'd recommend eliminating the buttonholes and creating a faux closure with poppers instead. And the fabric types that need to be avoided are anything with stretch and anything that's very lightweight or drapey. And the other thing to avoid is any fabric that has a directional print or pile to it. So that means the print has images that all face in the same direction, such as on this horse print cloth, or it has a pile to it that changes direction, such as a velvet or corduroy. As the main body piece is cut in one continuous piece of cloth and is also folded crosswise when cutting to accommodate the large pattern pieces, it won't be possible to have the direction of the print or pile facing upwards or consistently across the piece. However, stripes or checks work well, and the large continuous shapes are also a great opportunity to use a big bold print that would be lost on a design with lots of seams in it, like the non-directional flower print I designed for the summer version here. And then the last consideration is that if you're making the longer version, version, the cloth needs to be at least 140 centimetres in width. So to summarise, for a warmer winter coat or a spring-autumn jacket, you're looking for a mid to heavyweight cloth that can be either very structured or with a little bit of drape to it, such as a wool melton, tweed or boucle. And for a lighter summer coat or jacket, you're looking for a mid-weight cloth with lots of structure to it, such as a denim, canvas, heavy cotton drill or sturdy linen. And some other fun options could be a Dupion or Duchess silk to create a dressier evening version that would work really well as a top layer for special occasions like weddings or graduations, or a structured PVC or oilcloth to make a raincoat version, which is one that I really want to try and line in Sherpa fleece for my dog walks. And whatever cloth you choose, it's important to have structure at the collar and lapel. So that means either choosing a cloth that already has quite a lot of structure to it, such as melton, faux leather or denim, or adding interfacing to stiffen if it's naturally a little bit more drapey. Swing coat project notes. As this project is quite technical, there are a few things to consider to make sure you get a good finish at the end before we get started with the step-by-step tutorial. Firstly, it's really important to press well throughout, as this is one of the things that will make the biggest difference to the look of your finished coat. And to help you do this, you'll need a sleeve board or seam press to get inside the coat and really work the seams, and a pressing cloth to prevent shine if you're using a wool, which can just be a scrap of lightweight cloth that you have left over from another project, like the viscose piece you'll see me using throughout the step-by-step tutorial here. And you'll also need something to help work out the corners of the lapels and the fronts. I find a small wooden manicure stick is best. We call these orange sticks in the UK, and they're pretty easy to get hold of at beauty supply stores. But a corn skewer or anything similar would work as well. And the next thing that's needed to get a really great finish with this project is to be really meticulous about marking all the notches and punch holes very precisely, as they're key to getting everything to line up really nicely at the end. And I'd recommend a chalk pencil or cloth marker to help you do this. Next, although the coat has a tailored feel to it, it doesn't involve traditional tailoring techniques. I did train in Savile Row bespoke coat making, but these are personal methods of mine that I've evolved over the years, and they're a little bit faster and more accessible, which is why I wanted to share them with you in this tutorial. But that does mean if you already have some tailoring knowledge, some of the techniques might seem a little unusual to you. And if you already have a preferred method of constructing a notched lapel or any of the other methods, do feel free to do them your own way instead. There's always many ways to approach things with sewing, and these are just the methods that I like best. And then following on from that, I'm going to be going into a lot of detail in this tutorial, as I want it to be easily achievable for as many people as possible. So if you are more experienced, there'll probably be some sections you'll want to skip through, such as how to do a felling stitch and how to sew on a button. So I'd advise having a quick watch of each chapter first before you start sewing, and take what you need from each stage. And then a couple of technical things. As the main body pattern piece is so large, I decided to also use it for the body lining. So you're not having to print out and assemble hundreds of pages if you're using the A4 version. But this means there are some really important instructions to follow when cutting the lining, which I've separated into its own chapter to keep things really clear. Then the method to create the pocket and buttonhole openings can take a couple of goes to master. So I'd advise cutting a couple of extra interfacing pieces for the buttonhole facing and pocket slit facing to practice on some of your leftover scrap fabric first, before cutting into your main body piece, especially if you're using an expensive cloth. And I give the standard stitch length as 2.5 throughout, but if you're using a very heavy cloth like this wool melton, then it's best to switch that to a 3. And finally, I'll be giving instructions for the coat to close with the right side over the left, which is the standard way for female clothing. But if you're used to a male style closure, then do feel free to switch the buttonholes onto the left. And as a little fun fact for you, right over left tended to be the preference for all genders, but this was changed in historical military jackets to accommodate wearing a sword on the left-hand side, so the handle of the sword wouldn't catch the front of the jacket when being drawn. So that's absolutely everything you need to get the most out of this tutorial, and we're ready to get started with the project. Step 1. Assemble sewing pattern. Print out your pattern, being careful to print at 100% scale and checking the scale guide on the first page against your tape measure to be sure. Next, cut each page along the purple boundary lines as needed, and stick the tiles together with tape or glue using the tile map in the instructions as a guide. Then cut each pattern piece along your chosen size and you'll have 13 pieces in total. Main body, sleeve, top collar, under collar, lapel facing, front facing, cuff facing, pocket lap, pocket slip facing, buttonhole facing, pocket for the long version, and pocket for the short version. Make sure to punch out the marked holes on the pattern pieces. There are holes to mark the pocket and buttonhole positions, and to help sew the lapel on the main body. 8 holes on the sleeve, 5 on the lapel facing, 4 on the front facing, 2 on the top collar, 9 on the under collar, and 4 each on the pocket slip facing and the buttonhole facing. To make the short version of the swing coat, cut the main body and front facing pieces along the line as shown, and discard the lower parts of the pattern or save it for later. Also note that there are 2 different pocket pieces for the 2 length versions, so make sure to pick the correct one for your project and put the other to one side. Step 2. Cut fabric. Make sure to iron your fabric first with plenty of steam at an appropriate heat for your fabric type. Then fold your main body fabric in half crosswise with the right sides facing, matching up the selvages as closely as possible. Fabric folded crosswise looks like this, and fabric folded lengthwise looks like this. Then lay your pattern pieces onto the fabric using the cut and lays in the instructions as a guide, and making sure the grain line on each piece runs parallel to the selvage. When you're happy with your lay, pin into place and cut out each piece as close to the edge of the pattern paper as possible. If you're using a contrast fabric for the collar, lapels and finishings, then it's just the main body and sleeve to cut out from your main fabric. Take care to mark the notches on all your pieces and the position of the punch holes with chalk. When marking the buttonholes, make sure the pattern piece is laying with the text facing up as shown here, and mark onto the cloth closest to the paper only. When marking the pocket position, make sure to pick the right markings for your length version and place a pin through each of the 4 holes. Then carefully unpin the pattern piece and separate the layers using the pins as a guide to mark the points of the pocket position on both sides of the right side of the cloth. Then place pins through each of the 8 buttonhole markings and flip the cloth to use the pins to transfer the markings onto the right side. The chalk markings on the sleeve should all be on the reverse of the cloth on both pieces of the pair. If your fabric looks similar on both sides, it's a good idea at this point to mark the reverse of the cloth with a chalk cross to keep things clear later on. Next, take your contrast fabric if you're using one and lay, pin and cut out your undercollar, top collar, cuff facing, lapel facing, front facing, pocket facing and pocket lap. Make sure to cut 2 pairs of the pocket lap, so 4 pieces in total. And take care to cut neatly at the top of the front facing and the bottom of the lapel facing, where the seam allowance has risen steps in it. Mark the notches onto each piece and the position of the punch holes with chalk. To mark the break line on the undercollar, unfold the piece with the right side facing up and relay the pattern piece onto each side so you can mark through the punch holes. Then use a ruler to join the points up in a nice smooth line. Then take your interfacing and cut out your pocket slip facing and buttonhole facing, making sure to mark the punch holes, plus any of the other facings you're choosing to reinforce. I'm only adding interfacing to my undercollar in this example. Step 3. Cut lining. To cut the lining, we first need to adjust the main body pattern piece by folding along the line marked here. To do this, cut along the line marked cut here for lining first, which allows the pattern to fold nicely. Then fold the pattern back along the lining guideline so it looks like this and tuck under at the bottom so you can see the curve of the hem clearly. Then take your lining fabric and fold it in half crosswise with the right sides facing and lay and pin the adjusted main body piece, matching the centre back up with the fold. Then take a tape measure and mark a dashed line with chalk, 1/2 inch below the curved hem at the bottom of the pattern piece. This gives the lining an extra bit of ease and will be where we'll cut the lining, not the edge of the paper. Then lay and pin the sleeve piece and cut both of the pieces out, making sure to cut the hem of the main body out along the chalk line we've just drawn, not the edge of the paper. And finally, cut out 2 pairs of pockets, so 4 pieces in total, making sure to use the right pocket pattern piece for your coat length version. Then mark your notches and punch holes onto the lining pieces as before. There's no need to mark the pocket position on the main body lining, But it's important to transfer the hem notches down to the new lowered lining hem, so we can match them up with the notches on the hem of the main body outer piece when we sew. And make sure to also mark the notches that run down the lining fold line, which will help us match the lining to the facings later on. Then unpin and unfold the main body pattern, and you can add a little tape to close the split we made in it, so it's ready to cut the main fabric again if you decide to repeat the project. Step 4. Create pocket and buttonhole openings. Take the main fabric body piece and lay it on the table right side up. Then locate one of the sets of chalk dot markings you made earlier that indicate the pocket placement. And take one of your interfacing pocket slit facing pieces with the wrong side facing up and pin it into place by matching the corresponding pocket placement markings and placing a pin through each of the 4 chalk dots. Make sure the rough side of the interfacing that has the glue on it is facing up towards you. And to make the next part easier to sew, you can draw a line to join the 4 chalk dots up into a rectangle using a ruler and pencil or cloth marker. Then repeat the process on the other side for the second pocket. Then locate the chalk markings for the buttonhole placements, which should be on the outside of the main body piece here, and place the interfacing buttonhole facing pieces over the top in the same way, matching and placing a pin through each of the 4 chalk dots and drawing a line between them to form a rectangle with a pencil or cloth marker and ruler. And we're going to follow those lines with stitching on the machine. Starting at one of the chalk dots with a small back stitch, use a small straight stitch with a length of 1.5 to sew between the points following the pencil lines as a guide. Use your needle as a pivot at each of the corners by lowering your needle into the cloth at the point of each chalk dot and lifting the presser foot to spin the fabric 90 degrees. Continue sewing the whole way round to form a complete rectangle until you meet back at the point where you started. Then repeat the process to sew back over your stitches a second time and end with a small back stitch. Then repeat that process in exactly the same way for your second buttonhole and each of your 2 pocket openings. So the buttonhole should now look like this and like this from the other side. Then cut open the buttonhole following the shape I've marked here in pencil. Use a pair of small sharp snips to do this, starting by cutting a line through the centre that stops about 1 centimetre away from each end, then snip from each corner up to meet the line in the centre, being very careful to cut close to but not through your stitches. So it should now look like this, and repeat the process for the other buttonhole and each of your pocket openings. Then take one of the pocket openings and push the interfacing through the hole to the back. And we're going to fuse the interfacing to the reverse of the body piece to hold the pocket opening into place. Pull the edges of the interfacing piece firmly first before doing this, and the aim is to really work the seams out to the edge to get a crisp finish and a neat rectangle shape. I find the easiest way to do this is to first pull at the corners of the interfacing and fix each one of these down with the heat and steam from the iron. Then, when those are secure, to work along the 2 long lines of the pocket opening, aiming to get as straight a line as possible. And when you're happy with the shape, apply plenty of steam and pressure, and then press again from the front, checking the shape and using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed. Then repeat the process with the second pocket opening and each of the 2 buttonholes, so they should now look like this. Step 5. Assemble pockets. Take your 2 pairs of pocket lap pieces and pin them together with the right sides facing. And we're going to sew them together on the side with the stepped seam allowance, from the ends up to the chalk dot markers, leaving them open in the middle between the 2 chalk dots to form the pocket opening. Start at the end of the piece with a back stitch and use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5 and a 1 centimetre seam allowance, stopping when you reach the chalk dot with another back stitch. Then leave the middle section open and start sewing again at the second chalk dot to the end of the piece with a back stitch at the beginning and the end. And repeat for the second pair of pocket laps, so they should both look like this. Then press the seam open down the middle, and the aim is to also press the middle section open evenly, so that the larger seam allowance there is folded back to 1.5 centimetres the whole way along. and press again from the front to really fix it into place, using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed. Then take one pair of your pocket lining pieces and lay them on the table facing each other as a mirror image, with the right sides facing up. And take the 2 pocket laps you've just sewn and match and pin them to the straight edge of the pocket pieces, with the right sides facing down. Then repeat that process with the second pair of pockets, this time pinning the 2 pocket facing pieces to the straight edge with the right sides facing. And we're going to sew all 4 pieces together down the straight edge. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. And repeat for all 4 pocket pieces. So they should now look like this. And we're going to flip the facing piece back so that the seam allowance is sitting underneath the pocket piece, and sew a line of top stitching at the edge of the lining to hold it down into place. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, and you want the top stitch to fall just a millimetre or so away from the join onto the lining side, catching the pocket down to all layers of the seam allowance as you go, with a back stitch at the beginning and the end. So it should look like this from the front, and like this from the back, with the seam allowance fixed down neatly into place. And repeat the process for the other 3 pocket pieces. Give each of the pieces a press flat with your iron. Then, on the reverse of your pocket lap, use a chalk pencil to mark a dot at the point where the opening starts and finishes. Then lay your main body piece onto the table with the right side facing up, and locate the pocket opening closest to the buttonholes. Then take the pocket piece you've just sewn that looks like this, that has the pocket lap to the left and the pocket lining to the right when the wrong side is facing up towards you, and we're going to fix this piece underneath the pocket opening so that the side with the pocket lining is facing towards the front edge of the coat, and the rounded edge at the bottom of the pocket is facing down towards the hem. And we want the split in the pocket lap to sit right in the middle of the pocket opening. So keeping this piece the same way up, slip it underneath the opening and centre the split in the lap in the middle, using the chalk dots you've just made to help match the end of the pocket opening to the ends of the split in the pocket lap piece, and pin it into place. Then, making sure the pocket bag is laying flat to the right underneath, add a pin to hold it in place to the main body piece to make sure it doesn't flip under and get caught in the stitching when we fix the pocket opening. And repeat for the other side, with the position and direction of the other joined pocket lap and pocket bag piece looking like this. So here's how that looks close up. And it's worth taking your time here to get the split sitting nicely in the middle, so you end up with even laps on your faux bound pockets. And we're going to sew a top stitch at the edge of the pocket opening to fix everything together into place. Start at the corner of the pocket without a back stitch, and use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, aiming for your top stitch to fall just a millimetre or so away from the edge of the pocket opening onto the main body side. Sew around all 4 sides of the rectangular opening in a continuous stitch line, lowering your needle into the cloth to use it as a pivot at the corners, and taking care to keep everything as even and straight as possible. And it can be helpful to use an orange stick or something similar to help tuck in the cloth at the edges of the opening to make sure the corners stay crisp. Take your time here, as this part can be a little challenging, and keep sewing until you reach back at the point where you started. Then pivot to overlap the first stitches you made by a couple of centimetres to secure and finish. So the opening should now look like this from the front and like this from the back, and repeat for the other side. Then lay the main body piece flat onto the table wrong side up, with one of the attached pocket pieces facing up towards you. Then take one of the joined pocket and pocket facing pieces, making sure it's for the corresponding side, and lay it face down on top. Then pin the 2 pocket pieces together around all sides, matching the edges and notches as you go. And we're going to sew them together, starting with the straight edge, then sewing around the curved edge of the pocket bag, flipping the body piece out of the way to allow us to sew just the edge of the pocket pieces together. Then manoeuvring the cloth at the corner to allow you to sew around the curve of the pocket bag. Starting at the straight edge, use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. So the first line of stitches will look like this, Then flip the body fabric out of the way to reveal the curved edge and continue sewing the whole way around the curve of the pocket, right back up to the other side with a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end. So the pocket will now look like this, and we're going to sew another line of stitches close to the reverse of the pocket opening here to keep everything fixed securely into place. Use a zipper foot for this part to allow you to get really close to that edge with ease. Start sewing at the stitch line you've just sewn with the backstitch and use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, aiming to sew right up to where the pocket opening meets the pocket facing. Keep the pocket lap held down really flat to the sewing machine table, and I find it easiest to hold the cloth in place by hand while sewing, but you can pin it into place first if you prefer. And when you get to the stitch line at the bottom, finish with a backstitch. So it should look like this, with the line of stitching sitting right behind the seam allowance of the pocket lap, and like this from the other side. So you should now have a finished pocket that looks like this from the front, with the pocket bag laying neatly behind towards the front edge of the coat. And to finish, give the pocket opening a last press from the front to make sure everything is sitting really nice and flat, using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed, and then repeat for the other pocket. Step 6. Assemble sleeves and sleeve linings. Take one of your sleeve pieces and lay it on the table with the right side facing up. And we're going to start by sewing the sides of the sleeve together, which are these 2 edges here. Fold the sleeve to bring these 2 edges to meet and pin together with the right sides facing, matching at the top notches and chalk dot markers, and pulling the bottom part of the seam together so that the edges match right down to the tip of the point, and repeat for the other sleeve. Then sew the seam together, starting with a backstitch and using a straight stitch with a length of 2.5 and a 1 cm seam allowance. When you reach the chalk dot in the middle of the seam, lower the needle into the cloth and pivot slightly to continue sewing in a continuous line. Then finish the seam with a backstitch when you reach the chalk dot at the end of the point. So it should look like this at the end of the line, with the stitches stopping exactly at the matched chalk dots. Now, with the seam you've just sewn laying like this in front of you, we're going to work in a clockwise direction to bring the next 2 triangular points to meet, joining them together along these 2 edges. Pinch the 2 sides together at the base of the V shape between the points and pin into place, matching the notch in the middle and the chalk dot markers at the end of each point. So it should look like this, and we're going to sew together starting at the folded edge and ending at the chalk dot. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end, sewing right up to the chalk dot to meet the first line of stitches we just sewed. So it should look like this with a backstitch where the seam meets the fold here, and like this at the bottom where the chalk dots and lines of stitching meet, and like this zoomed out from above. And we're then going to move around the bottom of the sleeve in a clockwise direction, repeating that process to bring all of the points together to meet in the centre. You'll need to pin and sew these one at a time. Use exactly the same stitch settings, and each join should look like this. Keep going until all of the points are sewn together and it looks like this, and there's just one part left open at the bottom of the circular opening here, which will become the cuff. Bring these 2 edges to meet and pin together as before, matching the notches and the chalk dots. For this last seam, it's best to change over to a zipper foot, as it will allow you to stitch right up to the chalk dot, avoiding the bulk of fabric where the points meet. So the bottom of the sleeve will now look like this. Then take your scissors and snip through the middle notch on the seam we just sewed at the base of the cuff, being careful to snip close to but not through your stitches. And do the same thing at the seam we sewed first, snipping into the notch at the middle of the seam next to the central chalk dot marker. Then press your sleeve into shape by first pressing open that first long seam down to the point you've just made the snip, then pressing open the first section of the seam at the base of the cuff, just above where we made the other snip in the cloth. Next, snip away the end of each of the triangular points to reduce the bulk, and press each of the seam allowances to one side in a clockwise direction around that central join, so it looks like this. Then press the central join really flat from the front of the sleeve, making sure all the seams are still laying to one side in the same direction underneath, and using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed. And continue pressing each of those seams to one side, using a sleeve board or seam press to get right up to the end of the seam lines. Then, at the central join at the bottom of the sleeve, use a chalk pencil to mark a dot on each of the seam lines, 1/2 inch away from the central point. So it will look like this up close, and we're going to join the dots together with a top stitch to form a hexagon shape. To add a decorative touch and hold the seam allowances down neatly into place, start at any of the points with a backstitch and use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, lowering your needle and using it to pivot at each chalk dot until you reach back at the point where you started and end with a small backstitch. So it should look like this from the front, with the top stitch forming a decorative hexagon, and like this from the back, with the seam allowances and the bulk at the middle of the join secured down neatly into place. Then repeat this process for the second sleeve and for each of the sleeve lining pieces. The process to assemble the sleeve linings is exactly the same, with just 2 exceptions. As the lining fabric is much lighter, you don't need to cut down the ends of the points where they meet at the join, and there's no need for the decorative hexagon top stitch either. Instead, just give the central join a good press flat like this. Step 7. Attach sleeves. Lay the main body piece out onto the table with the right side facing up, and we're going to attach the sleeves into the armholes, which are these 2 U shapes here. Take one of your sleeves with the right side facing out and locate the double notch at the open end, which matches to the double notch at the armhole here, and will guide you to place the correct sleeve into the correct armhole. Match and pin the double notches on the sleeve and body together with the right sides facing, then match and pin the top edge of the seam and the notch at the base of the armhole to the underarm seam of the sleeve. Then do the same with the second sleeve on the other armhole. So if positioned correctly, your sleeves should now look like this, with the circular cuff openings facing outwards away from each other. Then bring the front edges of the body piece down to continue pinning each sleeve in around the armhole, matching the single notches and the top edges of the sleeves to the front of the coat. So it will now look like this from the front when laid out flat, and like this from the back. And we're going to sew the sleeves in around each of the armhole seams as pinned. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end. It's easiest to sew from the inside of the sleeve, with the sleeve piece on top and the body piece on the bottom. Take care when going around the curve at the bottom where the seam in the sleeves meets the underarm, as this part can be a little fiddly. Next, press the seams flat from the inside. Then, from the front, press the seam allowance to one side towards the sleeve piece, working the whole way around the armhole and using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed. So the seam should be laying flat towards the sleeve like this. Then repeat this process in the exact same way to attach the sleeve linings to the body lining. The stitch instructions are exactly the same for the lining as are the pressing instructions. Step 8. Prepare and attach undercollar. Unfold your undercollar piece and lay it face down, and we're going to attach the interfacing undercollar piece to the back of it. You can see the difference between the shapes of the top collar and the undercollar here. Make sure the rough side of the interfacing that has the glue on it is laying face down towards the back of the fabric piece, and use plenty of steam and pressure to fuse the 2 pieces together, as it's really important to get a strong bond here so the pieces become as one. Next, we're going to sew a line of stitches along the chalk line we made earlier at the cutting stage that defines the fold of the collar. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5 and a back stitch at the beginning and the end, sewing all the way along the chalk guide in as smooth a line as possible. So it will look like this and like this from the other side. Then fold the piece along the line you've just sewn with the right sides facing and use your iron to press and hold the fold into shape. Making sure to press the fold in really firmly so it retains its shape. So it should now look like this when looped around. And give the two larger ends of the piece a firm press flat and you'll see the undercollar starting to take on a really nice shape. Now take your main body piece and lay it onto the table with the right side facing up. And we're going to attach our undercollar to the neckline, which is this space here. Open the undercollar out like this, and it's the smaller folded side that we're going to attach. Find the notch in the middle of that smaller side and match it to the notch at the centre back of the main body with the right side facing and pin it into place. Then opening the rest of the undercollar out flat, continue to pin along the rest of the neckline, matching the edges and notches as you go until you reach the corners. So those corners should now look like this up close. And at the start of this stitch line, we need to attach the short end of the undercollar to the first section of the lapel. To do that, unpin the undercollar from the corner, then bring that end around so that the chalk dot on the undercollar is matching with the chalk dot at the middle of the top of the lapel and pin it into place. Then match and pin the next chalk dot at the lower corner of the undercollar with the chalk dot at the corner of the neckline on the main body. So it will look like this, and we're going to start by sewing between those two chalk dots before manipulating the fabric to continue sewing in a straight line along the lower edge of the undercollar. Starting at the first chalk dot with a backstitch and using a straight stitch with a length of 2.5 and a 1 cm seam allowance. So up until the chalk dot at the fold line of the undercollar and lower your needle into the cloth at exactly that point. Then rotate the cloth and take a pair of small sharp scissors and very carefully snip into the seam allowance of the main body fabric from the corner right up to about 1 mm away from the machine needle. This will release the fabric, allowing you to rotate the pieces using the needle as a pivot so that the seam allowances of the next section of the undercollar and main body can lay flat against each other, and you can continue sewing along the line with ease. Keep sewing all the way as pinned until you get to the chalk dot mark at the other end of the undercollar fold line. Then lower your needle into the cloth and repeat the process of lifting the presser foot to snip into the main body fabric at the corner up to about 1 mm or so away from the machine needle. And to finish, we're going to spin the end section around so that the next chalk dot on the undercollar matches up to the chalk dot at the middle at the top of the lapel on the main body piece, and add a pin to hold it into place. Then carry on stitching in a continuous line until you meet the matched chalk dots and end with a backstitch. So the corners should now look like this up close. And if needed, you can snip a little bit closer to the stitch line, being careful to cut close to but not through your stitches. Then press the two short end sections of the seam open first and press the longer middle section so the seam allowance faces away from the main body up towards the undercollar. So it will look like this from the back. Then use a sharp pair of scissors to snip away the excess fabric on the seam allowance of the undercollar at the corners. And finish with a last press from the front, making sure everything is sitting neatly to get a really nice crisp finish. Step 9. Prepare top collar, lapel and front facings. Take your lapel and front facing pieces with the pattern pieces laid on top of them as a guide. If you're making the short version, your front facing will be considerably smaller and cut off along this line. The front edge of the lapel facing is here, and the front edge of the front facing is here. Bring the front facing to sit below the lapel facing like this, and we're going to join the pieces along the central section here. Open the pieces out so you have the right sides facing up towards you in two sets of mirrored pairs like this. The buttonholes will be formed on the pair on the left hand side here, which will sit on the inside of the right hand side of the coat when we're finished, which is why we have these raised sections in the seam allowance along the join line. The pair on the right hand side here will not have buttonholes, as they will sit inside the left hand side of the coat where the buttons are when we're finished. So once you're sure you have your pieces laid out exactly like this, trim the raised section of the seam allowance down on the two right-hand pieces to make a straight line. Then bring the two pieces to meet right side together along this join and pin into place. And do the same for the left-hand pair, being careful to match the chalk dots on each side up to each other precisely. The pair with the straight seam allowance will have a simple 1 cm seam joining the pieces together. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. For the other pair, where the buttonholes will be formed at the join, we're going to sew as I've marked with chalk here. Sewing from the start of the seam up to the first chalk dot, then leaving the next section with the raised seam allowance open to form the first buttonhole, then another line of stitching between the next two chalk dots, followed by another open section for the second buttonhole, and a final line of stitching from the last chalk dot to the end of the seam line. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5 and a 1 cm seam allowance from the lower edge of the seam. Pull the cloth through the machine at the sections of the raised seam allowance that we're leaving open and use a back stitch every time you start and end your stitching, as the chalk dots will form the end point of the buttonholes and we want them to be secure. So the finished result will look like this, and finish by trimming away the thread from the open sections. Press the seam allowance flat, then open for the side that has the regular seam, and for the side with the buttonhole openings we're also going to press the seam flat then open, aiming to create an even 1.5 cm turn back at the open sections where the seam allowance is wider. So it should now look like this, and like this from the other side. Next, take your top collar piece and lay it right side up on the table, with the joined lapel and front facing pieces you've just sewn laying right side up in the exact formation as shown here. So the side with the two open buttonholes is sitting on the right like this. And we're going to join the pieces together at these two sections. Flip the lapel pieces down over the top collar piece, so the right sides are facing, and match and pin the two pieces together, starting with the section on the lapel facing that sticks up at a small angle, then straightening the cloth on the lapel piece to make sure the edges and the chalk dots meet, and ending at the second chalk dot, and repeat for the other side. And here's what that looks like up close. So this section will stay open to form the notch of the lapel, and we'll join the two pieces together here, matching up the two chalk dots, with the end sections of the seam meeting to join here. Add a pin through each of the chalk dots precisely, then pull the angled part of the lapel piece down to match the edge of the top collar piece, so it sits in a straight line like this, sewing from the chalk dot up to the end here. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. So it will look like this. Then take your snips and carefully cut through the seam allowance of the lapel piece at the chalk dot in the middle of the line, being careful to cut close to but not through your stitches, and repeat for the other side. Then press both seams open with your iron, using plenty of steam and pressure, so the top collar, lapel facings and front facings will now be connected together into one piece that looks like this. Step 10. Attach top collar, front facings and form lapel. Lay the main body piece out on the table right side up, with the front edges and undercollar in a straight line at the top. Then take the joined top collar, lapel and front facing piece you've just sewn and lay it right side down on top of it, so that the longer edge of the collar is at the top and the lapel and front facings are angled down towards you. And pin the top and undercollars together at the top edge, matching the notches as you go. Then leaving the V-shaped notch at the end of the collar open, continue to match and pin the lapel and front facing down the front edge of the main body piece on both sides. And we're going to sew them together, starting at the hem and ending at the point of the V-shaped lapel notch. Then starting again to join the outer edge of the top and undercollars, leaving the second V-shaped lapel notch open, and continuing down the remaining front edge to the hem on the other side to finish. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end of each of the 3 sections of sewing, making sure to leave the lapel notches open for the moment. So it should look like this, and we're going to understitch the seam allowance as follows. For the lower section, where the front facing meets the main body, understitch the seam allowance to the front facing side, ending at the join with the lapel facing here. Above the join, where the lapel facing meets the main body, we'll understitch the seam to the main body side, starting the stitch at 1 inch above the join line. And the seam allowance where the collars meet will be stitched to the under collar side. Start at the hem of the coat with a backstitch and use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, aiming for your stitches to fall a millimetre or so away from the join between the pieces onto the front facing side, catching all layers of the seam allowance under it as you go, and ending with a backstitch when you meet the point where the front facing and lapel facing join. Then make a chalk mark 1 inch above the join and flip the seam allowance underneath to the other side so it's sitting underneath the main body fabric, and start your understitching again with a backstitch at the chalk mark, this time with your stitches falling onto the main body side, a millimetre or so away from the join, through all layers of the cloth and seam allowance, and finish with a backstitch when you get to the open section at the top of the lapel. You'll now have the joined collar pieces in front of you, and ready to flip the seam allowance between them to the left so it's sitting underneath the under collar side, then understitch onto the under collar side, with the stitches falling a millimetre or so away from the join, catching the seam allowance down as you go, with a backstitch at the beginning and the end. Then repeat as before down the other side of the coat, understitching the seam allowance to the main body side on the lapel section, ending 1 inch above the join of the lapel facing and the front facing, then flipping the seam allowance under to the right to stitch it to the front facing side below the join between the lapel and the front facing all the way down to the hem. So it should look like this as you move along that front edge, with a 1 inch gap above the join in the facings and the understitching changing sides, then an open lapel notch and understitching at the edge of the under collar. Then trim the seam allowance down to 0.5 centimetres along both the collar and front edges you've just sewn. Be really careful with this so as not to catch or make any holes in the outer of your coat or collar. Next, we'll seal up the opening at the notch of the lapel, with the under collar side facing up towards you. First, match up the seams at the base of the notch and add a pin to hold into place, taking care to be really precise about the seams matching up exactly. The seam allowance we've just understitched and trimmed will naturally roll over at the end towards the under collar side. To help us sew exactly up to the meeting point of the seams at the centre of the lapel notch, snip into the seam allowance of the main body piece and the lapel facing piece up to the chalk dots where your pin should be sitting, and we'll sew a straight line up to that central point, then rotate the fabric to continue along the rest of the opening. Starting with a backstitch, use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5 and a 1 cm seam allowance. And when you reach the join of the seams at the base of the notch, lower your needle into the cloth, then lift the presser foot, remove the pin, and rotate the cloth while carefully releasing the seam allowance that you snipped into so it's laying flat against the machine bed, and continue sewing along the other side of the notch opening. End with a backstitch and be careful to keep the seam allowance at the end rolled upwards and tucked in tightly, and repeat in reverse for the other side. So the lapel notches should now look like this, and like this at the join at the base of the notch, with all 4 pieces of cloth meeting exactly into one unified point. This part can be a little tricky to master, but it's important that the joins match here exactly in order to get a neat finish. So don't worry if you don't get this right first time, but do be prepared to unpick and re-sew to get a precise meeting point if needed. as this small section makes a big difference to the look of the lapel and the final coat. When you're happy with your stitching here, trim the 2 seam allowances you've just sewn right down to about 3mm, and then trim away a little further again at the corners to reduce the bulk to help us get clean points at the tips of our lapels. So it should look like this. Then turn the pieces through to the right side and use an orange stick or something similar to help work the corners out and create neat points at the tips of the lapel and the collar. So it should look like this. Then use your iron to press the whole front edge of the coat into shape, rolling the seam inwards towards the direction of your understitching at the front facing, and leaving a small lip of the main body fabric at the edge, so that the facing won't be visible here from the outside of the coat. Then switch direction at the lapel so that the seam rolls under towards the coat with a small lip of the lapel facing at the edge. And at the point where the lapel and front facings meet, press so the seam is right on the edge, blending smoothly between the 2 directions, so it will look like this. At the collar, press the seam towards the understitching on the undercollar, with a small lip of the top collar at the edge, and work the seams at the notch right out to the edge and press into shape, rolling the seams under ever so slightly towards the back so you can't see the join lines from the front of the lapel. Take your time pressing here and use plenty of steam and pressure and a cloth to prevent shine if needed to get a really nice finish, as pressing well at this stage will make a really big difference to the look of your finished coat. Then place a pin precisely through the join between the lapel and the collar, matching the upper and lower joins exactly. Then thread up a hand needle on the double, and we're going to add a final stitch inside to keep the lapel fixed neatly into place. With the pin still in place, open up the inside of the lapel and hand stitch the seam allowances of the main body and the lapel facing together at the join. Use a big stitch and bring your threads over the edge of the seam allowance each time, coming close to the machine stitches of the seam at the bottom. Don't worry about being neat and tidy here, as you won't see this from the outside, and it should look something like this. Then, keeping the join pinned together, open up to reveal the seam allowance at the other side inside the collar, and repeat the hand sewing process, catching the seam allowances of the top collar, undercollar and main body together at the join. Then tuck everything back around the right way, and when you remove the pin, the hand stitches will be neatly holding that join into place, keeping it nice and secure from both sides, while also allowing a little bit of movement. Step 11. Attach lining and bag out. Lay the coat onto the table with the right side facing up. Gather the main body fabric and sleeves together in the middle, and open out the facings and top collar pieces so that they sit right side up around the outside of the piece. And we're going to attach the lining around this outer edge. Lay the lining right side down with the lining sleeves tucked into the middle, and pin the outer edge of the lining to the outer edge of the front facings and top collar, matching the notches as you go with the right sides facing. And we're going to sew them together all around this outer edge in one continuous line. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. So it should now look like this. And then flip the lining to bring everything around the right way. Then, using a sleeve board to help you get inside the coat, press the seam allowance flat towards the lining side the whole way around. Next, spread the collar of the coat flat onto the table and smooth the top collar cloth to get it sitting really nice and flat. Then add a few pins at the base of the collar to hold it into place. Next, thread up a hand sewing needle on the single and sew a line of basting stitches along the bottom of the collar. This is a big loose stitch to hold the collar in place for the next stage that will come out at the end, so it doesn't need to be neat or pretty, and any thread will do. When you finish the basting stitch, remove the pins, and we're going to use another hand stitch to permanently fix down the base of the collar, but from inside the coat by lifting up the lining and joining the seam allowances that run along the bottom of the top and undercollar pieces here, between the points where the 2 armholes start. Hold the collar piece in your hand through the lining to give you support. As we've already roughly secured the collar down with the basting stitch on the outside, you should find that the seams of the main body armhole and the lining armhole will match up. Start here by adding a stitch to secure the seams of the main body armhole and the lining armhole together. Then stitch along the line, catching the seam allowance that joins the undercollar to the main body to the seam allowance of the top collar and the lining. Use a double thread for this to make sure it's strong, and you should be catching the seam allowances together close to the seam of the undercollar and the main body, but making sure not to go over the machine stitching line, so the stitches aren't visible from the outside. When you meet the points where the armhole seams meet, you can add a couple of extra stitches to strengthen the line. And don't worry about the stitches being neat, as they won't be seen from the outside of the coat. Carry on stitching all across the back neck until you reach the end of the second armhole, and add a few stitches in the final matched armhole seams to secure and finish. Then bring the coat back onto the table and flip the lining back around so the coat is inside out. Then starting at the corner where the front facing meets the front edge of the main body, match and pin the open hems together, matching the edges and notches as you go, all the way around the bottom of the hem up to the other corner, making sure the seam allowance at the very corners is flipped over towards the front facing side, which should happen naturally because of the understitching. Then sew together using a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end, and trim the seam allowance down to 0.5 cm the whole way around. Next, reach inside the coat through one of the open cuffs in the sleeve lining and grab the hem corner at the opposite end of the coat to pull everything the right way around through the hole. This process is called bagging out. Be very gentle doing this and take it slowly, especially with longer length versions and thicker cloths, to make sure you don't make a rip in the cuff of the sleeve lining. Then push out the front hem corners by using an orange stick or something similar to reach back inside the coat through one of the lining cuffs, and gently push the cloth at the corners outwards with the stick until it forms a crisp point. Then press the hem into shape by working the seam line all the way out to the edge and rolling the inside under slightly to leave a small lip of the main body fabric so that the lining won't be visible from the outside of the coat. This may take a little bit of time on the longer version as the hem is so wide, but take your time to get a nice finish and take care to keep the line smooth at the point where the lining meets the front facing. Step 12. Finish cuffs. With the coat the right way around, bring the sleeves of the lining to sit inside the sleeves of the main body, making sure they aren't twisted. Bring the seams at the bottom of the main body cuff and lining cuff to match and pin into place. Then continue to pin the lining and main body together around the cuff, matching the edges and notches as you go, and repeat for the other sleeve. Then starting at the seam with a backstitch, sew together using a big straight stitch with a length of 4 and a 0.5 cm seam allowance, all the way around the cuff until you reach back at the point where you started and end with a backstitch. So they should both look like this. Next, take your cuff facing pieces and your bias binding, and with the cuff facing right side up, we're going to open one of the folds in the bias binding and match the raw edge of the binding up to the outer curved edge of the cuff facing, sewing into the groove of the fold on the binding to fix them together. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5 and a backstitch at the beginning and the end, matching the edge of the binding to the outer edge of the facing and aiming for your stitches to fall as close as possible into the groove of the binding. I prefer to move the binding into place as I sew, but you can pin it first if you prefer. Cut the excess binding away at the end, and it should look like this and like this from the other side, and repeat for the other cuff facing. Next, press the binding outwards towards the edge over the top of your stitching. Then turn the piece over to press open the fold on the other side of the binding. Then bring the two straight edges of the cuff facing to meet, with the right sides facing, and pin together, matching at the ends. Then sew the seam together using a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end, continuing from the end of the facing to the outer edge of the binding. So it should now look like this. Press the seam open, then fold the raw edge of the binding under to the reverse of the cuff facing, pressing it into place and tucking it as tightly as possible to the edge of the cuff facing as you go. And we're going to sew a line of stitches at the join here to fix the binding into place. Start at the seam in the facing and use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, aiming for your stitches to fall as closely as possible into the join between the facing and the binding, taking care to keep the raw edge of the binding neatly tucked under as you sew. So it should look like this and like this from the other side, and give it another press over with your iron. Next, take a sleeve of your coat and turn one of your cuff facings inside out. Then match and pin the seam in the cuff facing to the seam on the sleeve cuff with the right sides facing and pin into place. Then continue to match and pin the cuff facing and sleeve around the rest of the cuff opening, matching the edges and notches as you go. Then sew into place, starting at the seam with a backstitch and using a straight stitch with a length of 2.5 and a 1 cm seam allowance, the whole way around the cuff opening in a loop until you reach back at the point where you started and end with a backstitch, and repeat for the other side. Next, press the seam allowance upwards towards the cuff facing. Then carefully trim the seam allowance down to 0.5 centimeters, taking a little extra off at the point where the seams meet to reduce the bulk. Turn the cuff facing back and tuck it inside the sleeve. Then, at the edge of the cuff, bring the facing up so it's sitting over the top of the seam allowance, and create a lip with it that sits 1/4 inch up from the edge of the cuff, and pin it into place as shown. Then work the whole way around the cuff, repeating this process so you have an even lip of the contrast facing fabric all the way around the opening. And we're going to fix it into place by sewing a line of stitches into the ditch at the join between the two cloths. Start at the seam at the base of the cuff with a backstitch and use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, aiming for your stitches to fall as close as possible into the join between the cuff facing and the sleeve. We call this technique stitch in the ditch. Keep sewing the whole way around the cuff until you reach back at the point where you started and end with a backstitch. And the finished result should look like this, with the stitches hidden in the ditch of the join between the two fabrics and barely visible from the outside, and like this from the inside, with the cuff facing held neatly down into place. Give the cuff a press over with your iron using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed, and then the last stage to finish the cuff is to hand stitch the edge of the facing to the sleeve lining. Turn the sleeve inside out, then pin the cuff facing up so it's sitting nice and flat and evenly the whole way around. Then take a hand sewing needle and thread it up on the single, with a knot at the end in a colour that matches the bias binding. Then starting at the seam in the cuff facing, hide the knot on the reverse and use a felling stitch to catch the edge of the cuff where the binding is to the sleeve lining, being really careful to sew through the sleeve lining only without catching the main fabric of the sleeve. A felling stitch should look like the diagram here, with the needle coming out first at the edge of the binding, then directly in front of it into the lining fabric, moving forward to the left about 4 mm through the lining fabric, then coming out and back through the edge of the binding, ready to repeat the stitch again. It's really important not to catch the fabric of the outer sleeve, and you can use your non-sewing hand to help you with this, by placing it under the fabric as you sew, so you can feel if the needle is coming through to the outer layer or the lining only, which is what you want. When you get back to the point where you started, finish with a double stitch to secure. Then turn the sleeve the right way around and check that the stitch has gone through the cuff facing and the lining only, so the lining should still be able to move freely inside the sleeve. Step 13. Finish buttonholes and attach buttons. From the front of the coat, use a chalk pencil to mark the end of the button openings on the facing. Then line up the buttonhole openings on the main body over the top of the buttonhole openings on the facing and pin into place. Make sure the split in the facing is sitting exactly in the middle of each buttonhole, with the chalk dots you've just made sitting neatly at each end of the opening. The placement of these two openings has been worked out quite precisely on the pattern, so you should find they fall naturally into the right place without too much effort. And we're going to top stitch onto the main body around the edge of each opening to fix everything together in the same way we did with the pocket openings earlier on. Start at a corner of one of the buttonhole openings and use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, sewing along the edge of the opening onto the main body side, aiming for the stitches to fall just a millimetre or so away from the edge. Lower your needle into the cloth at the corners and use it as a pivot to spin the piece around, sewing the whole way around the opening in one continuous stitch line. Don't use a backstitch at the beginning and the end, but when you get back to the point where you started, pivot the cloth to overlap the first stitches you sewed by a couple of centimetres to secure. Then repeat for the other buttonhole. So they should now look like this, giving the look of a bound buttonhole and securing the facing neatly down into place. Then give the buttonholes a really good press flat to finish using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed. Next, take your buttons, and to find the correct placement position, make sure the front edges of the main body and front facing are sitting nice and flat against each other and not twisted. And add a pin to hold them together. Then place a couple of pins through the first section of the join line where the front facing meets the lapel facing, and use a chalk pencil to draw between the pins onto the front of the coat to transfer the position. Next, take one of your buttons and position it over the top of the line so that it sits with a 1/2 inch gap from the front edge of the coat. Then use another pin to mark where the centre of the button falls and move the button to one side to mark that point with chalk. So we now have the correct placement point for the first button and we can sew it into place. If it's your first time sewing on a button or you'd like extra guidance, I'll show you this in close-up next. For the second button placement, add a pin to hold the front facing and the main body flat together in the correct position. Then repeat the process of putting 2 pins through the join in the facing, this time a little further along the line, then drawing a chalk line between them to mark the position of the join onto the front of the coat. Then place the first button through the second buttonhole as shown here, and pull it along so it's sitting as close as possible to the end of the buttonhole nearest the front edge. Then making sure the hems of the front edges are lining up nicely, align the first buttonhole over the top of the chalk line you've just drawn, and use a chalk pencil to mark a dot through the end of the first buttonhole closest to the front edge of the coat. Then unbutton the coat to sew the second button on at the mark point. If marked correctly, the buttons should be 3.5 inches apart. To sew on your buttons, use a thicker thread if you have one for added strength, and thread your hand sewing needle up on the double with a knot at the bottom joining the 2 ends together. Then place your needle through the chalk mark point, through all the layers, and out through the join in the facings, so that the knot is sitting on top of the outside of the coat, and go back up through exactly the same point, so your needle is now on the front of the cloth. Then bring the needle through your button and take the thread back down through the exact same point, and come up to come through the button again, repeating that a couple of times, going through the button and back through the exact same point in the cloth every time. Don't pull the thread down tight as the button should be loose at this point. And to help keep that looseness, you can slip an orange stick or something similar underneath the button as you sew to create a bit of space between the button and the cloth. Then to tighten the button and create a button stand, bring the needle back up through that same point one last time out to the front of the cloth underneath the button, and then tightly wrap the thread around the base of the button until you've created a little column with the thread and the button feels secure. And then knot the threads a few times around the base of the stand to finish. So the buttons should now look like this, and like this from the other side, with the stitching hidden into the join in the facings, and holding the facing down to the front in the correct position. And finally, do up the buttons while the coat is laying flat to check everything is sitting really nicely and the hems match. Step 14. Top stitch hem and final press. Open the coat to the inside and make sure the front facings are sitting neatly and laying flat at the hem corners, then add a pin to hold them into place. And starting at the point where the lining meets the front facing, we're going to sew a line of top stitching along the edge of the hem to make sure it sits nicely and the lining doesn't droop down. Starting with a back stitch, use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, 5mm away from the edge of the finished hem, so from the inside of the coat, and make sure that the lining is laying flat away from the join as you sew, and that the small lip of main body fabric that you rolled under and pressed in at the edge earlier is visible. As this part has already been pressed into shape, I prefer not to pin it. Just make sure that the lining is going through smoothly and not twisting as you move along the line. Keep going until you get to the point where the lining meets the front facing on the other side, and then end with a back stitch. And the finished result should look like this, and like this from the other side. And then give the hem a good last press flat with your iron, using plenty of steam and pressure. To press the collar into shape, find the line of stitches on the undercollar that shows us where it should be folded. Then fold both the undercollar and top collar together along this line. This should be a soft rather than a hard press, meaning that you're not applying lots of pressure, but instead using a light touch and plenty of steam. The goal here is to set the cloth into shape, but with a soft fold rather than creating a harsh line with the iron. So as you press, your iron is hovering just at the surface of the cloth, and you're letting the steam do the work for you. Next, to press in our lapels, find the point at the end of the undercollar where the folded stitch line meets the corner, and the lapel is going to be folded from that point up to the join where the lapel facing meets the front facing. We call this the break line. As with the collar, we want to use a soft press here, hovering just at the surface of the cloth rather than weighting down with lots of pressure. The turn at the base of the lapel should be just at the point where the buttons or buttonholes start, and there should be a little volume away from the front rather than it being crushed down to a flat sharp angle to give a softer, more polished, tailored look. So then the very last thing you can do is to get the coat onto the stand, if you have one, and just have a double check that everything's sitting really nicely at the front there. So we can check that our lapels are even on each side, and also that it's turning nicely at the point where the buttons meet the lapel here. And if needed, you can give it a last spritz over with the iron. Thanks so much for watching. If you're sewing along at home, I hope you have an amazing new swing coat in front of you right now and you're feeling super proud of yourself. This pattern has been a bit of a labour of love for me and I really can't wait to see what you do with it. So please do tag me in your photos and videos. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Sasha__Starlight, and you can use the hashtag Starlight Swing Coat for this project. Creating a tailored style piece that's super accessible is something that I've wanted to do for a really long time. So I'd love to know how you found it, and if you'd like to see more pieces like this, or if you'd prefer something a little bit simpler next time. Let me know in the comments. But for now, I hope your new swing coat brings you all the joy for many years to come, and I'll see you next time.